The CNN studio lights blazed as the split-screen debate between Senator Ted Cruz and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett reached its boiling point. Cruz, his voice rising with practiced indignation, leveled his gaze directly at the camera. Congresswoman Crockett's interpretation of the Supreme Court's ruling isn't just wrong, it's a deliberate misrepresentation designed to mislead the American people. As someone who's argued 9 cases before the Supreme Court, I can tell you unequivocally that the court's opinion explicitly rejected the very legal theory she's promoting. The network moderator turned to Crockett's screen, clearly anticipating a heated retort to match Cruz's intensity. Instead, the former civil rights attorney calmly adjusted her glasses and replied with measured precision, "Senator Cruz, I appreciate your experience before the court." However, on page 17 of the majority opinion, Chief Justice Roberts writes, and I'll quote exactly, "This ruling does not foreclose legislative action in the area specifically described by the petitioner's secondary claim. The legal theory I referenced is precisely that secondary claim, which the court declined to address on procedural grounds rather than rejecting on merits. I have the opinion right here if you'd like me to read the full passage." The studio fell silent for a beat. Cruz's expression froze in a moment of genuine surprise as he shuffled through his own papers, clearly searching for the reference she had cited with such precision. The moderator, equally taken aback by this unexpected pivot from political talking points to substantive legal analysis, leaned forward with newfound interest. This wasn't going to be the typical cable news shouting match viewers had tuned in, for they were witnessing something far more compelling: the power of precise preparation over political bluster. If you're watching this video, hit the like button and subscribe to see more moments when substantive knowledge trumps partisan talking points. To fully appreciate the significance of this confrontation, it's essential to understand the backgrounds and motivations of these two formidable legal minds whose paths crossed in this high-stakes television debate. Senator Ted Cruz had built his reputation as one of the Senate's most skilled debaters. A Harvard Law graduate and former Texas Solicitor General, Cruz had indeed argued 9 cases before the Supreme Court, a record he frequently cited to establish his legal credentials. His sharp rhetorical style, honed through years of debate competitions and courtroom arguments, had made him a formidable presence in both legal and political arenas. Cruz approached television appearances with strategic precision, typically arriving with prepared talking points designed to control the narrative. His debate technique often relied on overwhelming opponents with rapid references to precedents and legal principles that non-lawyers would struggle to counter effectively. This approach had proven particularly effective in cable news formats where time constraints and the pressure of live television gave advantages to the most assertive speaker rather than the most accurate. For this CNN debate on a recent controversial Supreme Court ruling, Cruz had prepared thoroughly, focusing on aspects of the decision that supported his political position while developing dismissive responses to counter likely opposing arguments. His confident demeanor reflected years of success in framing complex legal issues in terms that resonated with his political base. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett brought a completely different background and approach to the encounter. Before entering Congress, she had established herself as a respected civil rights attorney with extensive trial experience representing clients against powerful institutions. Rather than using her legal background primarily as a credential, Crockett had maintained an active engagement with substantive legal analysis throughout her transition to politics. What distinguished Crockett's preparation for this appearance was her focus on the primary source material rather than prepared talking points. In the days before the debate, she had methodically studied the full 87-page Supreme Court opinion, including concurrences and dissents, identifying specific language that nuanced the broad characterizations dominating political coverage. While others prepared by reviewing media summaries and partisan analyses, Crockett had gone directly to the legal text itself. The substantive issue at stake involved complex questions about federal agency authority and congressional delegation matters where precise legal language carried significant policy implications. The court's ruling had been immediately seized upon by political figures on both sides, with each claiming vindication for their preferred approach to regulatory governance. These competing interpretations created the perfect conditions for a confrontation between political messaging and legal precision. CNN had framed the segment as a standard partisan debate, selecting Cruz and Crockett as representatives of opposing political perspectives rather than specifically seeking legal expertise. The network's expectations, and likely those of most viewers, were for an entertaining exchange of familiar talking points rather than substantive legal analysis. The moderator, a veteran political journalist with limited legal background, was prepared to manage conflict rather than evaluate legal arguments. What made this confrontation particularly noteworthy was that both participants brought legitimate legal credentials to the exchange. This wasn't a case of a legal expert versus a political surrogate, but rather a clash between two different approaches to using legal expertise in public discourse. Cruz's strategic deployment of legal credentials to enhance political messaging versus Crockett's substantive engagement with specific legal language and reasoning. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test whether cable news formats, typically structured to amplify conflict rather than substance, could accommodate genuine legal analysis when a participant was sufficiently prepared to transcend the expected political script. The CNN segment began with the familiar trappings of cable news political theater. Dramatic music introduced the face-off graphic as the host, Anderson Cooper, framed the debate in suitably contentious terms. Tonight, two perspectives on the Supreme Court's landmark ruling in Department of Commerce v. Environmental Alliance. Is this a victory for democratic accountability or a dangerous hobbling of environmental protection? Joining us, Republican Senator Ted Cruz of Texas and Democratic Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, also from Texas. The split screen showed both participants in separate locations, Cruz in what appeared to be his Senate office, American, flag prominently displayed behind him, and Crockett in what looked like a congressional office with law books visible on shelves behind her. Cooper began with a fairly standard opening question. Senator Cruz, you've called this ruling a victory for constitutional governance. What specifically makes this decision so significant in your view? Cruz leaned slightly toward the camera, his response coming with practiced fluency. Anderson, this ruling represents a fundamental restoration of constitutional balance. For decades, unelected bureaucrats have been making decisions that properly belong to Congress. The court has finally said enough to the administrative state's overreach. As someone who's argued before the Supreme Court 9 times, I can tell you this ruling reaffirms basic separation of powers principles that are essential to our system of government. Cooper nodded and turned to the other screen. Congresswoman Crockett, you've taken a very different view, calling the decision deeply problematic. Why do you see it that way? Crockett's response came in a measured tone that contrasted with Cruz's more dramatic delivery. The court's ruling raises significant concerns about effective governance. While I agree with Senator Cruz that separation of powers is fundamental, the majority opinion creates practical uncertainty about how Congress can delegate technical implementation questions to agencies with relevant expertise. The ruling doesn't just limit agency overreach, it potentially hampers effective implementation of laws Congress has already passed. This initial exchange followed familiar partisan contours, with Cruz emphasizing constitutional principles and Crockett focusing on practical governance concerns. Cooper then moved to more specific aspects of the ruling. Senator Cruz, critics suggest this ruling could paralyze agencies' ability to respond to emerging problems, particularly in areas like environmental protection. How do you respond? Cruz's response took on a more dismissive tone. That's the same apocalyptic rhetoric we always hear whenever there's any check on bureaucratic power. The reality is much simpler. If Congress wants agencies to have specific powers, Congress needs to explicitly grant those powers through legislation rather than allowing agencies to discover new authorities in decades-old statutes. This ruling doesn't prevent environmental protection, it just ensures those protections come through proper democratic channels. Cooper turned back to Crockett. Congresswoman, your response? I think we need to be precise about what the court actually said, Crockett began, subtly shifting toward the more substantive approach that would define her contributions. The majority opinion doesn't categorically reject delegation of technical implementation. On page 42, Chief Justice Roberts specifically acknowledges that Congress may authorize agencies to fill in details and apply general standards to a next to by specific factual scenarios. The question is where that line should be drawn, and the court provides limited guidance on that critical question. This reference to a specific page of the opinion demonstrating first-hand knowledge of the text represented a departure from typical political talking points. Cruz, perhaps sensing this shift, adjusted his approach to emphasize his own legal credentials. With respect, Congresswoman, you're mischaracterizing the court's position. Having actually argued cases under the major questions doctrine, I can tell you that this ruling absolutely limits agencies' ability to make policy decisions of vast economic and political significance without clear congressional authorization. The Chief Justice's opinion leaves no doubt about that fundamental principle. This response, invoking his litigation experience while offering a general characterization without specific textual references, created the Veritas opening for the confrontation's pivotal moment. Cooper, following standard format, asked Crockett to respond to Cruz's characterization. "Senator Cruz isn't wrong about the major questions doctrine," she began, acknowledging his point before pivoting to greater precision. "But the court's application of that doctrine is more nuanced than political summaries suggest." On page 31, Justice Roberts distinguishes between implementation of clearly expressed congressional intent and independent policymaking beyond statutory authorization. The ruling restricts the latter while preserving the former. Cruz, accustomed to controlling legal narratives in political settings, interjected with increasing assertiveness. "Congresswoman, with all due respect, that's simply not an accurate reading of the opinion. The court explicitly rejected the agency's interpretation of its statutory authority, which is precisely the legal theory you and the administration continue to promote." This interruption, attempting to re-establish authority through forceful contradiction, led to the exchange that would define the segment. Crockett remained unruffled, responding not with matching intensity but with increased precision. "I think we might be referring to different aspects of the ruling, Senator. The court rejected the specific application of authority in this case, but it did not categorically reject the agency's interpretation of the statutory framework. In fact, on page 53, the majority explicitly states that a different approach, with more substantial connection to the statutory text, might present a different question." This citation of yet another specific page and direct quotation demonstrated a command of the material that went beyond prepared talking points. Cruz, perhaps not expecting this level of specific engagement, responded with what appeared to be a prepared general rebuttal. The Congresswoman's interpretation simply doesn't align with the court's jurisprudence on administrative authority. This ruling clearly builds on precedents limiting agency power, and any suggestion that it leaves the door open to similar regulatory approaches misrepresents the court's position. Rather than matching Cruz's broad characterizations, Crockett continued her methodical reference to specific text. If we look at Justice Kavanaugh's concurrence, which was crucial to forming the majority, he specifically notes on page 61 that this ruling addresses the specific mechanism chosen by the agency rather than the broader statutory goals. He goes on to outline alternative approaches that would likely survive judicial scrutiny. This detailed knowledge of not just the majority opinion but a specific concurrence, complete with page reference, visibly surprised both Cruz and Cooper. The conversation had moved beyond the expected political debate into substantive legal analysis that required genuine familiarity with the primary source material. Cruz, perhaps sensing the terrain shifting away from political messaging toward technical legal discussion, attempted to re-establish his authority with an even more forceful assertion of his expertise. Congresswoman Crockett's interpretation of the court's ruling isn't just wrong, it's a deliberate misrepresentation designed to mislead the American people. As someone who's argued 9 cases before the Supreme Court, I can tell you unequivocally that the court's opinion explicitly rejected the very legal theory she's promoting. This escalation, moving from disagreement about interpretation to accusations of deliberate misrepresentation, marked the confrontation's climax. It represented a classic debate tactic. When challenged on substance, attack the opponent's credibility and reassert superior expertise. The strategy might have worked against an opponent less thoroughly prepared or more easily provoked into defensive responses. Instead, it created the opening for Crockett's defining moment in the exchange. "Senator Cruz, I appreciate your experience." Before the court. However, on page 17 of the majority opinion, Chief Justice Roberts writes, and I'll quote exactly, "This ruling does not foreclose legislative action in the area specifically described by the petitioner's secondary claim. The legal theory I referenced is precisely that secondary claim, which the court declined to address on procedural grounds rather than rejecting on merits. I have the opinion right here if you'd like me to read the full passage." This response, providing yet another specific citation directly addressing Cruz's categorical claim, created a moment of genuine surprise, visible on the senator's face. The specificity of her reference, combined with the offer to read directly from the opinion, made it clear that Crockett wasn't merely recycling talking points but had thoroughly studied the primary material. The confrontation had reached its pivotal moment, with Cruz visibly searching through his papers for the reference she had cited with such confidence. The dynamic had shifted from political positioning to a substantive examination of legal text territory, where preparation and precision could overcome even the most polished rhetorical skills. The studio fell silent for a moment that seemed to stretch much longer than the few seconds it actually occupied. Cooper, recognizing that something unexpected was happening, leaned forward with renewed interest as Cruz continued shuffling through his notes. "I believe the Congresswoman may be referring to dicta that doesn't affect the core holding," Cruz finally responded, using a legal term for non-binding commentary in judicial opinions. His tone had shifted subtly, moving from absolute certainty to a more qualified position. "The court's rejection of the agency's approach is still the central and binding element of the decision." Crockett nodded slightly, acknowledging his point without conceding the larger argument. "You're right, that portions of the opinion could be characterized as dicta, Senator. However, the passage I referenced comes in the application section where the Chief Justice is specifically outlining the scope and limits of the holding. It's not merely commentary but an explicit boundary statement about what the court is and isn't deciding." She continued with remarkable precision. This is consistent with Justice Barrett's concurrence, where she notes on page 73 that today's decision addresses a specific application of authority rather than the broader delegations within the statute. Both the majority and a key concurrence explicitly preserve space for alternative approaches. This additional citation demonstrating comprehensive knowledge of multiple elements of the decision rather than isolated quotes further established the depth of Crockett's preparation. Cooper, sensing the substantive shift in the conversation, attempted to harness it rather than redirect to more familiar political territory. "Senator Cruz, do you agree with the Congresswoman's characterization of these specific passages?" he asked, a question that would have been unlikely earlier in the segment before Crockett had established the conversation's new parameters. Cruz, a skilled debater with extensive legal knowledge of his own, adjusted his approach rather than continuing to challenge Crockett's citations. "There are certainly nuances in the opinion, including the passages the Congresswoman references. My point is about the practical impact and core holding, which unquestionably limits agency authority to act without explicit congressional authorization. The specific language she cites doesn't change that fundamental outcome." This response, acknowledging the existence of the passages while disputing their significance, represented a significant shift from his earlier categorical dismissal of Crockett's interpretation. The conversation had moved from competing assertions to a more substantive discussion about how to weigh different elements of a complex judicial opinion. Crockett built on this shift toward substance. "I think that's a fair point about the practical impact, Senator. The ruling certainly limits agency discretion in significant ways. Where I think we might still differ is on the question of what alternative approaches remain viable. The passages I've cited suggest the court is leaving open pathways for addressing these issues, albeit with more explicit statutory connections." This framing, acknowledging areas of agreement while precisely identifying remaining differences, further elevated the exchange beyond typical partisan positioning. Cooper, recognizing the unusual substance of the conversation, asked a follow-up that would have been unlikely at the segment's start. "Congresswoman Crockett, based on your reading of these specific passages, what approaches do you believe might remain viable after this ruling?" This question, seeking substantive legal analysis rather than political reaction, created space for Crockett to further demonstrate her command of the material. The opinion suggests three potential pathways. First, agencies could ground regulatory actions more explicitly in specific statutory language rather than broader purposive readings. Second, Congress could provide more detailed delegations that satisfy the court's concerns about democratic accountability. And third, as Justice Kagan notes in her partial concurrence, agencies could pursue similar outcomes through multiple narrower authorities rather than single broad authorities. Cruz interjected, though now with a notably different tone than his earlier dismissive interruptions. The Congresswoman's analysis overlooks Justice Thomas's concurrence, which suggests even more significant constraints on delegation. His perspective, while not commanding a majority, indicates where the court may be heading in future cases. "That's an excellent point, Senator," Crockett responded. "Justice Thomas would indeed go further in restricting delegation. But it's telling that the Chief Justice didn't adopt that approach in the majority opinion, despite having the opportunity to do so. That deliberate choice to pursue a narrower holding suggests the court isn't yet prepared to embrace the more sweeping constraints Justice Thomas advocates." This exchange, two skilled lawyers discussing the interplay between majority holdings, concurrences, and future jurisprudential trends had transformed what began as standard political theater into something considerably more substantive. Cooper's expression reflected recognition that viewers were witnessing something rarely seen in cable news, a genuinely informative legal discussion that moved beyond partisan talking points. As the segment neared its conclusion, Cooper asked a final question that acknowledged this transformation. We've heard a remarkably detailed discussion of this opinion. Let me ask both of you briefly. What's the most important thing ordinary citizens should understand about this ruling and its implications? Cruz, adapting to the segment's shift toward substance, responded with less partisan framing than his opening statements had suggested. Americans should understand that this ruling strengthens democratic accountability. It ensures major policy decisions will be made by elected representatives rather than administrative agencies. That's a victory for constitutional governance, even if it means the policy process may move more deliberately. When her turn came, Crockett maintained the substantive approach that had defined her contributions. I'd emphasize that this ruling creates both constraints and opportunities. It limits certain regulatory approaches but also provides a roadmap for more resilient agency actions grounded in specific statutory language. For citizens concerned about effective governance, the focus should be on encouraging Congress to provide clearer delegations rather than assuming regulation itself has been categorically restricted. As Cooper wrapped the segment, viewers had witnessed something remarkable. A political exchange that had transcended familiar partisan scripts to provide genuine insight into a complex legal issue. Rather than the expected shouting match, they had seen how precise knowledge and thorough preparation could transform even cable news formats into vehicles for substantive discussion. The victory in this confrontation wasn't merely political. Crockett hadn't simply scored points against Cruz, but had elevated the entire conversation to address the actual legal complexities rather than simplified partisan narratives. In doing so, she had demonstrated that precision and preparation could be more powerful than even the most polished rhetorical skills. As the cameras stopped rolling, the impact of the exchange between Cruz and Crockett was already reverberating beyond the immediate CNN audience. Video clips of the confrontation, particularly the moment when Crockett cited specific page numbers that Cruz couldn't immediately reference, began circulating widely across social media platforms and news sites. What made these clips particularly compelling wasn't merely the gotcha moment of a politician being caught off guard. Rather, viewers responded to the unusual substance of the exchange. Comments sections filled with observations like, "First time I've actually understood what this court decision really means, and why can't we have more discussions like this instead of the usual shouting?" Legal commentators from across the political spectrum noted the exceptional nature of the exchange. A conservative former federal judge wrote, "Whatever one's view of the court's decision, Congresswoman Crockett demonstrated remarkable command of the actual opinion rather than merely recycling talking points. This level of substantive engagement elevates our public discourse." Meanwhile, a progressive law professor observed, "Cruz's legal credentials are substantial, but Crockett's precision in directly citing specific passages showed how thorough preparation can overcome even the most polished rhetorical skills." For CNN, the segment generated unusually positive feedback across partisan lines. Viewers who typically criticized the network for promoting conflict over substance praised the exchange as informative rather than merely entertaining. This response prompted internal discussions about creating more opportunities for substantive legal analysis rather than predictable partisan positioning on judicial issues. The professional impact for both participants proved significant. For Cruz, the exchange represented a rare moment where his usual approach to controlling legal narratives in political settings had been effectively challenged. While his supporters maintained he had articulated the correct overall interpretation of the ruling, the visible moment of surprise when confronted with specific citations had created an uncharacteristic perception of being out-prepared on legal substance, his presumed area of expertise. In subsequent media appearances discussing court decisions, Cruz noticeably adjusted his approach, coming armed with more specific textual references rather than relying primarily on general characterizations and his credentials. During a Senate Judiciary Committee hearing the following month, observers noted he had printed copies of judicial opinions with specific passages, highlighted a concrete change in preparation approach following the Crockett exchange. For Crockett, the confrontation elevated her national profile beyond what would be typical for a freshman representative. Law schools and policy organizations began inviting her to speak specifically about effective communication of complex legal concepts in political contexts. A leading law review published her analysis of the Supreme Court decision, acknowledging how her CNN exchange had demonstrated the value of precise legal analysis in public discourse. Perhaps most significantly, the exchange influenced how other legislators prepared for public discussions of judicial decisions. Congressional staff noted increased demand for complete judicial opinions, rather than summary talking points when preparing members for media appearances on legal topics. A senior staff director observed, "The Cruz-Crockett exchange created a new standard. Members now worry about being asked about specific passages they haven't read rather than just general principles." This shift from political characterizations to substantive engagement with legal texts represented a small but meaningful improvement in public discourse about judicial decisions. Rather than treating court rulings merely as political victories or defeats to be spun for partisan advantage, more legislators began engaging with the actual legal reasoning and limitations expressed in opinions. Law professors incorporated video of the exchange into courses on legal communication, using it to demonstrate the importance of precision and primary source knowledge when discussing complex legal issues with non-specialist audiences. A Yale Law School professor noted in a widely shared article, "Crockett didn't simplify the legal issues to the point of distortion. She made complex legal distinctions accessible through specific references and clear explanations." This approach respects both legal accuracy and public understanding in ways political discussions of court decisions rarely achieve. Media organizations also took note of the unusual viewer response to substantive legal response plan discussion. Several networks began experimenting with segments focused specifically on detailed analysis of judicial opinions rather than merely their political implications. While these remained less common than standard partisan debates, they represented a meaningful expansion of approaches to covering judicial decisions in mainstream media. 3 years later, when a controversial Supreme Court decision again thrust judicial interpretation into public debate, a different senator referenced the Cruz-Crockett exchange when challenging a commentator's characterization of the ruling. "I'd like to follow Congresswoman Crockett's example and focus on what the opinion actually says rather than general characterizations." On page 42, Justice Alito specifically writes, "This direct acknowledgement using Crockett's approach as an explicit model demonstrated the lasting impact of the confrontation on how some politicians engaged with judicial opinions." In her own reflections on the exchange, Crockett emphasized the broader significance beyond the immediate political context. "Legal precision isn't just about winning arguments," she noted in a speech to law students. "It's about ensuring our public discourse actually addresses the real implications and limitations of judicial decisions rather than simplified caricatures. Democracy functions better when citizens understand what courts have actually decided rather than just who won or lost a case." This perspective captured why the confrontation had resonated beyond typical political exchanges. In an era often characterized by performative conflict rather than substantive engagement, Crockett had demonstrated that thorough preparation and precise knowledge could elevate public discourse even within formats designed primarily for political theater. The Cruz-Crockett exchange thus entered the broader conversation about political communication not merely as a momentary win for one side, but as a model for how substantive expertise could transform public understanding of complex legal issues. Their confrontation, culminating in Crockett's citation of specific passages Cruz couldn't immediately reference, demonstrated that precise knowledge of primary sources could prove more powerful than even the most polished political messaging, a lesson with significance far beyond any particular judicial decision. As we've seen in this remarkable exchange between Senator Cruz and Congresswoman Crockett, thorough preparation and precise knowledge can elevate political discourse beyond partisan talking points to substantive understanding. If you found value in this analysis, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more examinations of pivotal moments in political communication. Hit the notification bell to stay informed of our latest uploads. We welcome your thoughts in the comments. What aspects of Crockett's approach do you find most valuable for improving public discourse about complex legal issues? See you in our next video.